Welcome to the Morning Glory Project, Stories of Determination. I'm your host, Betsy Graziani Fossbender. Like in nature, we see determined flowers and vines clinging to life and seeking light. So are Morning Glory people. And in this podcast, I'll interview writers, activists, artists, entrepreneurs, survivors and thrivers, and trailblazers of all kinds. These are folks that have been determined to get over, under, around, and through the obstacles that face them, or to seize the opportunities that come before them. I find these people inspiring and amazing. I know you will too. It is my extreme pleasure today to welcome not only a mentor and colleague, but a friend in Brooke Warner. Let me tell you just a bit about her. Brooke Warner is the publisher of She Writes Press and Spark Press, president of Warner Coaching, Inc., and author of Write On Sisters, Greenlight Your Book, What's Your Book, and 3 books on memoir. Brooke is a TEDx speaker, weekly podcaster, Right-Minded, with co-host Grant Faulkner of NaNoWriMo, and the former executive editor of Seal Press. She currently sits on the boards of Independent Book Publishers Association, the Bay Area Book Festival, and the National Association of Memoirs. She writes a monthly column for Publishers Weekly. I can't believe she found 5 minutes to sit with us today with all that. But welcome, Brooke. I'm so happy that you're here.
Oh, thanks, Betsy. I'm so happy to be here.
So let me also share full disclosure with my listeners as well, which is that not only is Brooke a publisher, she's my publisher and has published so far 3 books with She Writes Press, and I couldn't be more honored to count myself what we call among the She Writes sisterhood. So that's where we are. So Brooke, you had your dream job when you worked at Seal Press. Tell us a bit about that and then what changed.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, when you said that, actually, my heart just kind of swelled and then fell a little bit, which is the experience that I had. I mean, it was my dream job. I almost get emotional thinking about it. When I first started, I had never been so happy to accept a position. I was 28 years old. I got this job as an acquisitions editor, and I just thought the sky had opened up, and just blessed me with this position. And for a long time, I felt that way at Seal. Seal is a very special press. I still think it is. But when I was there, it was very indie. Proudly indie, had this very strong history of publishing feminist books and women's books. And my world really opened up working there for so many reasons. The books we were publishing, the authors I was working with, the women that I was working with. And so it was just this incredibly rich time in my life. And I was 28, 29, 30. I think it's a time in your life too when horizons are opening. I didn't have a child yet. I was very much in my element, I guess you could say.
The glory days.
Yes, they were the glory days. Yeah, I really feel that. And then, what changed is that I was there for probably 6 of the 8 years, 6 years into my 8-year tenure. Really what happened is that we were bought by a corporate entity. That was the first thing. Susie Bright, who was one of my authors at the time, said, "This is going to be death by 1,000 cuts." I remember thinking that was a little dramatic, but that is in fact what it turned out to be.
How was it death by 1,000 cuts?
It was taking away something that a spirit, I guess, that I felt was there, just in terms of that very indie sensibility that we had. There was a new mandate, a new corporate structure that came in. And I can't blame Perseus, which is the company that took us over. They didn't do anything wrong in acquiring us, but it's that energy that shifts when you're part of something and then all of a sudden you're not part of that anymore and the new mandate looks very different. And they wanted us to be a much more corporate entity. And with that, the values changed. And so that really is the beginning of what happened. And there's a much bigger story to, the 2 years between 6 and 8 years at Seal Press and why I ended up leaving. But it was just a shift in the values and a shift in in the publishing world that I was a part of. And I felt ultimately that I had to leave.
Well, I've heard you tell the story before, but I hope you'll share it here, that of when you had a book that you were in love with and you wanted, it was sort of that proverbial straw in the camel's back. If you can tell that story of the book that you were advocating for and what they wanted instead.
Yeah, exactly. I tell this story in the TEDx talk, and it was the straw that broke the camel's back because before that, there had been lots of little things that had been bothering me. But what happened was that I really, really wanted to acquire this book about trans families. And I had been responsible at Seal Press for growing the LGBTQ list. And so transgender books were an important part of that. And this was an author I had known and kind of been cultivating for a while and had hoped to acquire his project. And basically the message was, we've kind of done enough trans books for a while, so let's not do that one. And I could have acquired it. You know, I could have basically stuck my neck out and gone for it, but I ultimately decided it wasn't worth the risk. And so it wasn't a month later that another book came through. And this book was about women looking better after 50, which just struck me as somewhat anti-feminist, not very aligned with our core values. But instead of, you know, the team being on board with our feelings about that, the general feeling was because she was attached to someone quite famous and because it was a high-powered agent that we should acquire this book. But to add salt to the wound, it was the most amount of money that I had ever spent on a project in my entire tenure at Seal Press. So it wasn't just that we acquired the book, it was that we spent a ton of money on it. And I just felt like everything kind of came crumbling down after that. And I was really upset by the juxtaposition of these two experiences.
So here you had a story that you loved and wanted to tell, and you'd have had to put personal risk out to make that happen and couldn't do that. And you were instead given a story that felt a little shallow, or at least not in alignment with your values. And there was a boatload of money thrown after it, you know, because it was going to be profitable, because that author was famous or conspicuous or had a lot of power in some way.
That's exactly right.
That seems to be the story of the publishing industry at large, not just Seal Press, but it seems like, I can say this as an author, more and more it's about whether you're conspicuous and famous rather than whether or not you write well. That doesn't mean there aren't some beautiful books being published. There are, of course. But it's hard to get in there.
Yes, yes. And it does feel that way. I mean, it does feel like this was exemplary of what I was seeing in the broader world of publishing around me. And I had just gotten to a point of being so disillusioned. And then this happened to me. And I felt like I don't want to be here anymore, because the gap between what I was doing in the beginning with this dream job and, like I said, just feeling like everything was exactly how I wanted it to be versus what I was looking at as the future laid out in front of me of the books that I was going to have to acquire, I just felt like I couldn't continue to support it.
Outside of the world of publishing, I think this happens to people in their jobs all the time. They have some niche or some working arrangement or some special job that they fall in love with, and then somebody who has their eye on only the bottom line or on a different direction altogether comes and kind of pulls the rug out.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is not a story just common to publishing. I think it happens all the time.
I agree, absolutely. And it does happen because things change. The world changes. I think there's something positive in all of this, which is I was pushed to do something that I was meant to do, and Seal is still a wonderful press. I don't want to disparage it. I think they're still doing wonderful books, but it wasn't the Seal that I knew, and it wasn't where I needed to be anymore.
So you made some cups of Tearwater tea, I imagine. That had to be such a grave disappointment to feel your dream job not being so dreamy. And how did you come up with your next steps? What was that like for you to be in that space of disappointment?
Yeah, it was really, really complicated. Not to mention because I was close with people that I worked with. There was a lot at stake for me to leave. It felt scary, certainly. And it felt like I was crazy because who would leave this job? It's the kind of job in publishing that only comes around once in a lifetime, really. This was a job that anyone would be vying to have, and acquisitions positions are quite rare. And so I was scared, but I also felt like where I was untenable. And I had been coaching a little bit, and I thought I could make it on my own as a coach. That's really what I was thinking, and that I would start this little publishing company. That my thought was really that we would publish maybe 5 books, 10 books a year, and that it would keep me with one foot in the publishing industry. And of course, that's just not at all what ended up happening. What ended up happening is that the press really took off almost immediately, and the coaching business has been quite supplemental.
So the press that we're talking about is She Writes Press, and it's a different model than is traditional. There's the old self-publishing, do-it-all-yourself model, and then there's the traditional publishing where you submit to a famous kind of New York publisher and get your book published. But She Writes Press was different. It was a hybrid model. Can you say a little bit about why you chose that, and maybe for those unfamiliar, what that is?
Yeah, it's very interesting because in the beginning, and you were there pretty close to the beginning, Betsy, I just thought I was going to be supporting authors to publish well. And I knew a lot about publishing. I knew what made it work. And I didn't have the word hybrid at the time. I just thought, well, this is sort of a co-publishing arrangement and we'll see what happens. And because it took off so fast, in the very first season, I think we already had something like 10 authors, which was how many I was planning to publish in the first year. And so because of that, I was kind of swept along very quickly into realizing that this press was going to be bigger than I had envisioned. And I don't just mean bigger in quantity, I mean making a bigger impact. And it was the early authors, you included, who said to me, you want to be thinking about this thing as something different than self-publishing because we are not self-publishing. And that was really the beginning of realizing, okay, we're not traditional because I don't want to be that or do that, but we are definitely not self-publishing. And so what are we? And it turns out we were and are a third way. And that third way has been increasingly defined over these 7 years to be that we vet. We do vet the manuscripts. The authors do pay. So there is an author subsidized aspect of this. But just because they pay doesn't mean that it's a self-publishing venture because they keep much higher royalties. We have traditional distribution, which is hugely important and makes us much more like a traditional publisher than a self-publishing company. And so we are in between. And since then, we have really defined what the hybrid landscape is. I think we're a leader in the hybrid landscape, the gold standard. A lot of people say we're an award-winning press. And so it's been amazing, but I don't think I could have made all of those definitions without the authors being the wind in my sails, because you and everyone has been so instrumental in being like, we are on equal ground here as our traditional counterparts. And I really believe that to be true.
Well, what fascinates me both from the inside looking out and the outside looking in at this phenomenon, really, of She Writes Press is how hungry women were and are for the opportunity to have their voices to be heard, and how many barriers they face in finding that as a possibility. So the money that an author pays, unlike the old, what they used to call vanity presses, where people paid a boatload of money to essentially a book hacker that slammed them together and pushed them out. This is something where an author pays what she might pay to self-publish. The efforts that she might put in to do that, to kind of offset so that you can take the risk, so that you can publish stories that may not ever be bestsellers, but because they're important to be told, because they're of value for that woman to tell them. And they're well written and well constructed. And of course, with your professional team, they're also beautiful books, and they look like they deserve to sit on the shelves of any bookstore. There, that's me bragging, but that's the darn truth of it. So what touches me, and also about your most recent book, Right On Sisters, as I read it, is that this is also really stems from your passion, really, to help women's voices get heard in an industry that has historically and even currently not valued the voices of women so much. There's a quote that I really love that you have in here, which says, "The very qualities our culture least values in women are the ones women need to succeed." Can you say a bit about those values and how you see this as creating an opportunity for women, and why you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are things that, and it's everything that I talk about in the book, I try to weave back around into women's writing lives, right? But I think the values that we're talking about in those moments have to do with how women approach their writing. And lots of times there is a focus, for instance, in fiction on family life or relationships or love, things around nurturing and caregiving. And those are places that in the work world, and this extends into the publishing world, get sectioned off as women's issues, which is ridiculous because, of course, men have very rich lives around relationships and family and nurturing and all kinds of things that might be considered, quote unquote, women's issues. And so we need those things. And one of the things that I write in the book is about how important community is to women, how important collaboration is. And it's not that they're not important to men, but I do see how women harnessing collaboration and partnership and community really results in women succeeding. And so I just found this, I guess that's what I'm trying to say in that quote, is that rather than women saying, oh, okay, well, these are things that we shouldn't tend to, they're the very things that we must most tend to.
Well, I remember hearing lots of people say, and particularly you as well, that you were told in the industry, grief doesn't sell, for example. So women that want to write about surviving loss or those kinds of things, they were told, we already have our cancer book, or we already have our grief book this month. So they weren't so interested in, and that's just not been your experience at She Writes Press at all. There are a lot of books about loss and love and grieving and surviving and all of those things. And I've been amazed to watch that.
It's because we don't have those same measures, right? I know this from having been at SEAL, exactly what you just said. Well, we have our quota of grief books. We have our quota of cancer books. We certainly have our quota of trans books, right? And I was thinking to myself, well, this trans book that I wanted to acquire, which was about families, we had never done anything remotely similar. The only other trans books we had on the list were like a memoir of transition. And I thought this family book would have been such an important addition to our list, but they really just blocked it off as, oh, well, that's a trans writer, and so therefore it's a trans book, end of story.
Well, what's funny about that is if you turned it on its side and you said to a traditional press, when a male author was submitting a book, oh, we've got enough politics books,
right?
Or we've got enough espionage books, or we've got enough action hero books. That just wouldn't even be said. It's like, oh no, those sold a lot, so let's sell some more of those.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's important, I think, for authors to see that too, because you'll hear that if you go to writers' conferences or if you pitch your books to agents. Oh, this is such a saturated category. We don't have any more room for abuse memoirs or addiction memoirs or whatever the case might be. But then the very next month, there you have St. Martin's or Penguin or whoever publishing that book. And so it's just also not true. There's always room for new stories, but the industry likes to cordon off certain things and, in my opinion, discourage writers from trying to pursue the books that they want to write.
Well, we've talked about the beginning of She Writes, and we've talked now about how successful it became, but I also want to talk about the challenges. You and I joke together, Brooke. And I always say that you were driving the covered wagon in this industry. And I was just one of the passengers, the first 4 or 5 passengers in the back of the wagon with you. But I know that starting this press and having it endure has not been a straight uphill or straight progress. It's had some setbacks. Can you say a little bit about some of those struggles that happened? And more importantly than just what the struggles were, how'd you get through them?
Yeah, I mean, the struggles were, they've been a lot, and often less so now, of course, because you get to a place where you are like, okay, we made it to the other side of some of these really hard things. And sometimes, of course, hard things still pop up. I still make mistakes. But early on, the biggest and hardest struggle certainly was the lack of distribution. I just saw that we had nothing. There was just nothing that I could do for the authors that resembled the kind of ability to get into the marketplace that I had when I was at Seal. And so trying to get distribution in the early days was a big hurdle because I had to answer those questions like, well, what are you guys? You're not a traditional press, you're just self-publishing. And to prove that we were doing something different and better. So the early days was a lot of fighting in the trenches. I felt like I was constantly at battle with a lot of naysayers just for legitimacy. That was a big struggle in the first maybe 2-3 years. And then the other worst thing that happened was a financial error that I made, which really stemmed from the fact that there was no one to talk to about our business model.
Because it didn't exist?
Right. I mean, no one was doing what we were doing. And so I had a big oversight around charging back authors for print on demand copies. And it was a huge financial error. It was to the tune of $50,000. And at the time, we had been recently bought by Spark Point Studio, who now owns She Writes Press. And if they hadn't been there to absorb that loss, we wouldn't have survived. And so that was personally very challenging because I felt personally guilty for that oversight. I didn't see it, and I didn't, it felt massive. Let's just put it that way. And I really took it as a personal failing. And so those kinds of moments when you start something, because the buck does stop at you, there was no one else to be like, oh, whoops, she didn't see that. It was like, no, I didn't. And I guess the way that I've come through it, I mean, I've felt the pain. It's very humbling, actually, to make mistakes like that and to walk through them. The only thing that heals them is time. I mean, when I think back at that time, I still feel a bit sick to my stomach about it. But you also can look back in retrospect and say, well, I got through that. We did right by our authors. That was the main thing. I've always tried to be very transparent and felt that it's better to own the mistakes and be human rather than just try to pretend like everything is perfect. But I have had some very hard conversations along the way, both with Crystal, who owns our company, and the authors and lots of other people. And I guess I've found some comfort in knowing that everybody who has a business or tries to start something new has to fail sometimes. It's just not a perfect straight line, as you said.
That's sort of a nice nugget to look at, is that somehow in our own endeavors, it seems as though our path ought to be perfect, even though we're perfectly understanding and forgiving of people who fumble and stumble a bit in their own paths. If somebody else were to start a piano tuning business, we wouldn't expect them to have every single thing go right in the first year. But somehow when we started, it feels like it ought to be, when I started, I feel like it needs to be perfect and flawless.
Right.
It's such a strange thing we do to ourselves, isn't it?
Yeah, we're very hard on ourselves. We set a very high bar for ourselves. Where we forgive others, we don't forgive ourselves. I think it's a really cultural kind of thing to get over. I mean, and it does connect to my new book, Right On Sisters, because I talk about that kind of conditioning that we experience. And it's an interesting thing, resilience. I mean, in some ways, the more you fail and the more you are able to get yourself back up and move forward, the more you learn about yourself in terms of like persevering and being able to do it. And I've learned so much. That's the other benefit that has come from the failures, is that I know more about this industry than I even knew existed when I was an editor at Seal Press. And that is very helpful. I sometimes feel like I can support others to understand things too, as people are coming up and as hybrid is becoming more of a thing. I love this idea that I might be able to support people who are starting something new to not make the same mistakes that I made because no one was there for me.
So some of those feelings of failure came from within, but you were also getting some attacks from without.
Mm-hmm.
The industry itself was doing some finger wagging and shaming and accusing, as I recall, saying what?
Yeah, saying we were a vanity press, saying that, just trying to suggest that paying to publish in any capacity is wrong. That there was a lot of accusations that we were just exploiting authors, taking authors for a ride. I mean, especially in the beginning, it just seemed so ridiculous because our prices were so low in the beginning. But in, just everything you can imagine trying to discredit what we were trying to do. And, yeah, it was hurtful because from the very beginning, we had such a, I should say, I should speak for myself, but I really had this desire to get out women's voices in a way that I couldn't do at Seal anymore. And so then to be attacked in that way, on the one hand, it was hurtful. And on the other hand, it was very motivating. I took my anger and really poured it into the press because I just was like, this is bullshit, what these people are saying. It wasn't true. And I knew that.
You know what it makes me think of? This is a story I read some time ago about this fellow that was working in the energy industry, and he's working for big oil and gas, but he was in this nice little corner of alternative energies, and he thought he was sort of going to be the champion for sustainable and renewable energies. And they didn't welcome it so much. And so he split off and started his own little energy company. And of course, then he got the slings and arrows of the oil and gas companies saying that he was a fake and a fraud and a huckster and all those things. So it's sort of like if you break off from the way that it's been done, the way that it's been done, people don't dig it so much. They feel threatened by it, and it's easy to accuse or judge or misjudge what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And there is, I think the word disruptor is a bit overused, but it was that. I think disruptors, when you're disrupting an industry, people are unhappy, and they were unhappy on both sides. The traditional industry, interestingly, embraced us more than the self-publishing community. And I think it's because they saw us as trying to differentiate ourselves from self-publishing as if somehow we were better, which was never the intention.
You're just another alternative.
Right. It was always another alternative. But I think because I saw what was lacking in self-publishing, which was the distribution.
Well, to get back to one other aspect of your newest book, Brooke, and to sort of close our conversation, you talk really eloquently in a way that I haven't seen so much about what is commonly referred to as the inner critic. We've talked about those external voices that criticize, but those internal voices that talk people out of their endeavors. In your case, you're talking about writing stories or sharing them, but you write that when it comes to our writing, emotional conditioning is likely to be the hardest of the conditions to get over because it's part of who we are. The inner critic is a belief system. And you say the inner critic is an equal opportunity offender. That, yes, men experience it too. Anybody's taking risks and starting new things, but that women seem to have a special intimate relationship with their inner critic that talks them out of courageous acts. You want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, just that the inner critic is very invested in the status quo. And so writing and self-expression is not the status quo. If you're putting your words out into the world and you're sharing things, especially if you're sharing things that feel risky or that people have told you shouldn't ever say anything about this, which is really true for a lot of people, including novelists, because lots of novelists are drawing from their own life. And so self-expression is super risky. And so it triggers all kinds of stuff with that inner critic. And I always talk about the fact it's not just like, well, is my writing good enough? It's all these other conditioning things that come up. Am I, I'm a fraud, which is imposter syndrome. I'm not worthy, or even like I'm too big for my britches is kind of one that a lot of women hear. Who do you think you are? I mean, the messages are just relentless. And I hear all of them because I talk to authors all the time. And there is no author that I have worked with who doesn't suffer from some of these messages. And it really is something that is courageous to overcome. And of course, when we're writing and even posting online and publishing books, we do have to overcome. But to suggest that that critic voice isn't with us every step of the way is just not true. It is. It's there. And so as such, I think it's really important to name it, mostly so that we know we're not alone and that we can learn to treat it a little bit more gently, like it doesn't have to have so much power over us.
Well, 3 years ago, the day after the inauguration of our current, I don't know what to call him, the day after the inauguration, I went for the first time ever, to the Library of Congress and just spent the day there. A fabulous place, by the way. And I was just struck by the fact that at that time, I had 2 books in there that my stories were saved for posterity. That, I don't have big ambitions about fame or those things, but I also thought about all of the women's stories that aren't in there, the women who had talked themselves out of or had been devalued or thought their story not worthy. And I recall something that you said to me, Brooke, when my memoir was about to launch, and I expressed this at a retreat site where we were. And I said, sometimes I just worry that maybe my story is too small, that it's just this little family story. And you said, your story isn't small, it's intimate. And that's what people want. So that's always stuck with me. And I've used it with folks that I've coached as well. You've helped now, I think, 600 books, 600 women's stories find their way to shelves, to readers, and to be documented for this period of history as the imagined and lived stories of women. It's a really important thing that you've done, and I can personally thank you. It's going to sound a little like apple polishing when I thank you on this podcast, but I'm truly grateful for this opportunity, and I'm grateful that you would share these things with us.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Betsy. And you've been such an important part of this community. And really, I hold you in my heart as a sister here, and I'm really grateful to be on your podcast. So thank you.
Well, now that we've nauseated everyone with our mutual congratulations, we'll say thank you so much for coming today, Brooke, and for making this time. I'm deeply appreciative that you would do this, given everything that's going on.
Oh, my pleasure.
And best wishes with Write On Sisters. It's for any author or any writer who wants to be an author, particularly women. It's a book that it's about 250 pages of great cheerleading and information. So not to be missed. Thanks again, Brooke, for joining us on the Morning Glory Project.
Thank you.
I found my conversation with Brooke Warner so inspiring. Somebody who had one dream, thought she'd achieved it, but then found another that proved to be better than she thought it ever would be. I'm always impressed by resiliency, and I'm impressed by determination. I'm impressed by just perseverance that keeps somebody going despite disappointments, despite obstacles, and even despite some of their own mistakes and having to learn a few hard lessons from them. And Brooke is a wonderful example of that. I'm so glad that she was here on the Morning Glory Project. I hope you've enjoyed this story. If you have enjoyed this or other stories on the Morning Glory Project, I invite you to subscribe wherever you find your podcasts, on Apple, Google, Spotify, and all kinds of other places. You can find information about upcoming episodes on themorninggloryproject.com. And if you're so inclined and feel positive about these interviews and they've given you a few nuggets of inspiration or ideas, I invite you to give us a positive review wherever you have subscribed to your podcast. It helps us get heard and helps the word get out. And I think the world can use a few wonderful stories of accomplishment and determination by these Morning Glory people. Thanks for listening. Go out and bloom.